and welcome to JJ, the JJ Dillon podcast. I am your co-host, JP John Paz, and with me, as always, is the star of the show, two-time Hall of Famer, the leader of the Four Horsemen, the second greatest manager of all time, former WWF and WCW executive, James J. Dillon. JJ, how are you doing this evening?
Great, John. How are you?
Doing very, very good, and again, this past weekend, you were hanging out with Barry Windham. Am I correct? You got to spend some time with Barry again?
Yes. And I always enjoy being around him. He's, he's really grown. When we were talking, I reminded him and the people that were there that he had his first professional match with me, that his father, Blackjack Mulligan, and Dick Murdoch had bought the Amarillo territory from the Funks. And young Barry was actually hauling the ring, and knew that it was one of his dreams to eventually put the tights on and get in the ring. But Jack, for whatever the reason, did not embrace that idea. It was okay for Barry to haul the ring, but he just, I guess, I don't know why. I never did have a discussion with him, because with Jack, it was either easier to ask for forgiveness than it was for permission to do something. But we just had Barry reminded me, it was a situation, we were somewhere in a town, and a bunch of the guys were really, really late getting there. I don't know if it was weather or other, and we were trying to get together enough matches to at least start the show. So I said, Barry, you got your gear? And everybody knows that with somebody that has an aspiration of doing it, to make sure you always have your gear with you, because you never know. And this was another prime example. So get your stuff. You and I are going to go on first. And that was his first match. And I knew the moment we locked up that he was destined to be a future star.
Very, very cool. And I love that you're kind of rekindling it with him a few weeks in a row, and obviously Arn as well a few weeks ago. So that is very, very cool. And last week on the show, we were talking a lot about you leaving NWA and the Crockett's and WCW and all that other stuff, and coming to the WWF, the world of Vince McMahon. And while you're there, Barry eventually comes on board. Arn and Tully are already there. But what we kind of really talked about mostly was kind of the senior VP, or the VP of talent relations, and what that role entailed. And you really kind of went into it. I mean, creative, booking, producing, payroll, dealing with the talent itself. Mm-hmm. That role is pretty intense, and when you really think about it, you have a lot of responsibility if you're the WWF VP of Talent Relations.
Yes, but really my whole career were like little pieces of a puzzle that prepared me for that opportunity. A lot of guys get into the business and their whole 100% of their concentration is on their own individual character or their own individual, situation where they are. And I started with Jim Crockett Promotions as a full-time wrestler months before my 28th birthday. So I knew that my career as an in-ring performer was going to be shortened somewhat, only because of the time in my life that I was getting in. So right from day one, it was, yes, I was totally committed to being the best that I could be as an individual performer, but also had a total awareness of all the other guys and how I fit into the big picture, the importance of television production, and then how a TV show was put together. And all of that prepared me for down the line when an opportunity came, and that was what was going to give me longevity in the profession.
Now, I think when people think of talent relations, they immediately just think of, you're dealing with talent, stuff like that. And last week you told a great story about how you're dealing with payroll and you're doing different things, and that story with the Macho Man, and and dealing with like the different personalities. Is that the hardest thing about being the VP of talent? It's just each guy has each distinct different personality, and they may take something, each the same thing, like a different way.
Yeah, that's a good point, because it's really it's one of the prerequisites of, if you're going to be in that role, you have to be prepared to be involved in some way with all these facets of the business. And it's not, a lot of guys can handle their own business, but being able to deal with a whole talent roster where you have people that are just starting out in their career, very ambitious. You have people that are veterans that have been around a long time, and each has to be treated in their own way, and you got to recognize how to do it. And as I've said before, the personalities are unique. That when you're dealing with talent, some guys need a pat on the back to be motivated to be the best they can be, and other guys you have to be more aggressive and occasionally give them a little kick in the keister. So it's knowing who they are and what you need to do to get the most out of them.
When you are in that role and you're dealing with the egos and the different guys and stuff, does it ever like you say to Vince, like, oh man, Macho Man, he's how do I deal with this guy, or if I have to deal with a certain person, do you ever go to Vince and say, how do I kind of massage this guy's ego, or how do I deal with this, or do you kind of figure that out all on your own?
I definitely had to figure that out on my own, and if I had to go to Vince with every individual and in every situation, which would have been a continual process, then I'm sure he would have thought after a while, what do I need this person for? I'm looking for somebody who understands the demands of that position and that role and can go out there and do it. So I was very fortunate that way. And I could get along with someone that was high maintenance, and I could get along obviously with a guy who wasn't, and be able to see the importance of the role that each of those individuals played, and that was important too. Looking at the big picture, and everybody is important. You can't. You may have to, like I say, give somebody a pat in the back to get the most out of them, and somebody else you got give them a little kick in the rear, kick in the butt, and it's knowing the individual personality and what it takes to motivate them, and that largely comes with experience.
Now, eventually, as you kind of move along in 1989, you start basically February of '89, but as you move across to the end of the year, Arn and Tully are already there, which is kind of cool. And you were saying last week, you don't really need the comfort level, but it is cool, that they're there, and obviously very, very good friend of yours. Eventually, towards the end of '89, Tully fails a drug test and is basically gone, and Arn will soon follow, and Arn heads back to WCW. But what's like kind of your thought process? What is your role, or do you have to report this? Do you find out about this first? Like, when Tully fails the drug test, kind of what happens?
Well, it was random drug testing, and I was distanced in order for it to have credibility and validity. I was distanced from it. In other words, someone else made the determination of when the random drug tests were going to be, and I didn't have advance warning. I didn't know till I got to the building, and I would always be one of the first ones there, and whoever was there, a medical person that was going to do it, and the guys knew what was involved. It was that they would have to give a specimen, and it had to be done where they would go into a bathroom with a guy, and the guy would not stand there in front of him, but he would stand there to make sure that that it wasn't substituted from someone else. And if they didn't have advance warning, and first thing he did was put a thermometer in the specimen to record the temperature, so that would tell them that if it was something that was taken immediately, or rather than having someone have it a specimen in their pocket where they could switch it. These were just the little things that you had to do to protect the credibility.
What were your thoughts when he failed the test? Shocked, pissed, like any sort of reaction emotionally about it?
Just disappointed for him as much as anything, and for the business, because it was because of the credibility. It was one of those things that you couldn't say, well, he's my friend, I'm going to try to figure a way to sweep this under the carpet and give him a free pass. And the minute that you approach something that or a situation like that with that frame of mind, the credibility of the program is gone, and everybody talks to everybody. They would know that. Well, don't worry about it. You're not if and the thought was too that, well, I'm too high up the pecking order to get busted. They're going to try to figure a way to get around this, and that was one thing that I would say. There were no passes. It didn't matter who you were. That if you got tested and got flagged, everybody suffered the same consequences. And obviously, it affected the business more for somebody that was higher up the pecking order.
Was Vince furious about it? Was it something that he reacts to, or is it just purely business? You fail a test, you're going to be fired.
Well, he wasn't happy about it when it happened because, when he brings somebody in, and this is true. The thing that Vince had was he controlled the television and controlled the exposure. So what he was giving a potential talent coming in was an opportunity to appear on television. And that is something, and then a lot of guys didn't really understand how important that was. That here's a television with an audience, and you're now being given an opportunity to be showcased on it. And don't ever take that for granted, because not everybody's going to get that opportunity.
It is crazy because at this point, Survivor Series Showdown, he's wrestling Ultimate Warrior in a pretty high-profile match, and then obviously he never makes it to Survivor Series, and he's replaced with Bobby Heenan on that team, and eventually Arn is still there and would soon there leave to WCW, but it is just kind of crazy that, wow, just like that, all of a sudden, boom, he's gone. Was there ever anything said between you and Tully at this point as he's making his exit?
No, not really, because he understood that it wasn't personal, that that was the way that it had to be, that if the first time that you even considered, this guy's too important, he's in the middle of a key program, it's going to affect our business, it could affect our houses, so we're going to find a way to ignore this, and if you did that, your credibility of your whole program was shot. And so then how do you the next time there's a failed test, how do you go by the letter of the law with that individual, knowing that there's a guy in that same room that was in that same circumstances that was let pass? You just can't allow that to happen. You either have a drug program that you totally adhere to it properly, or you don't. There's no halfway.
Now, Arn would eventually leave as well and head back, like I said, to WCW, and then Flair ends up coming in 91, kind of around basically year and a half, 2 years later. Flair ends up kind of coming in WWF. Was there ever any talks between Vince, maybe you or Flair at this point, and bringing him in 89?
Not that I remember, but I do remember the thing with Arn. I think Arn and Tully were supposed to come in as a team, and then I think it was Tully that failed a drug test, and they were already leaving coming in, so it immediately affected Arn financially because you couldn't bring them in as a tag team since one had not passed the test, and they couldn't perform as a team. So sometimes it involves more than just the individual who is, not passed the test. If he has a tag partner, and you got plans for the two of them, and then the one has a problem with a failed drug test.
Yeah, a lot of people realize, it stinks for Tully. Well, it stinks for Arn too. I mean, it's just as bad for Arn because, he is brought in as a tag team. They're the brain busters. Yep. They're doing things as a team. They're with Heenan. And then when Tully fails, it looks bad on him too because then they don't have anything for him.
Yeah, and it's like you don't have you if you're bringing them in and going to showcase them as a team, and then something like that happens, even if you try your best to do right by the one guy that's just a victim of the situation, maybe it never turns out the way it would have been if the failed drug test had ever happened and you brought them in as a team and gave them the push that had been designed originally.
So eventually they're leaving. Flair comes in. Was it a surprise to you at all that Flair would be in the WWF, considering, he was the face of the other brand? He's kind of literally is the world champion with the big gold belt showing up in WWF.
When you've been around the business as long as I have, even back to that point, nothing really surprises me, to be honest with you. As crazy as that sounds, it's just the nature of the business. You can't really fully take anything for granted, and you can't really be shocked or surprised at anything that happens.
Do you think that using the big gold belt and having him be the champion on TV and saying that he's a real world champion, do you think that's the right way to go? Were you kind of for it, against it, or didn't have any thought on the matter?
Well, he certainly was championship, had a pedigree for that, and so championship belt, it was like, I go back to championship belts were something that some guys needed to get to that level. It's like, well, somebody would finally ask the question, they say, well, how come Andre the Giant was never world champion or never had the big belt? Well, it's because he's Andre the Giant. He doesn't need it. He is going to be a drawing power just because not everybody walks around that's 7 foot tall or whatever it is. And that's not to say that somebody like Flair would not be a success, but sometimes that is the he lived the gimmick. He back when he first started in the Carolinas, he bought a limo and hired somebody to dress up and to chauffeur him around, and he did it because he had a vision of what he wanted to be, and made a financial investment of buying a car and paying a driver for a while until he got established. And a lot of guys don't ever think of their career that way, that maybe it involves an initial investment to get to where you think you want to be.
I'm even thinking about it from kind of a different angle, as far as it's not very old school. It's almost kind of wishy-washy that he is the champion of the other promotion, and he's actually has that belt on your TV program. Is that kind of like taboo? Is that something that's like, man, like somebody that's old school, even like yourself, like, man, that's kind of it's like a wishy-washy kind of thing?
Yeah, it's. I remember there was a situation too where Medusa had a belt, changed companies, and then took the belt and dropped it in a trash can. And I think that if a promoter gives you a belt, he's showing confidence in you and giving you a tool to help you be the best that you can be. And it's something wrong with you then turning around and taking that belt that he gave you in good faith to give you a tool to maximize your impact, and then have you take it and use that against him. Nothing surprises me in the wrestling business, but from a person inside, I would never want to do that. The understanding was, if you make me a champion, and if I plan to leave, I'm going to give you advance notice and figure out a way to drop the belt. I'm never going to leave with it. Though that has happened. Yeah.
Absolutely, and Medusa, you're right. She was the WWF Women's Champion. She goes on WCW Nitro, throws in the trash. So, yep, that is definitely true. And as far as bringing in Flair and bringing in guys, you're the VP of Talent Relations. Are you the one that is actually bringing them in, working them on the contract, and like, okay, Flair's a free agent, we're taking him here? Is that something that you're working on, or is there somebody else that's bringing the guys in?
Somebody else is bringing them. I never was involved in going out and recruiting talent or cherry picking talent from somewhere else and having it come in. I mean, you could do it in a kind of a left-handed way. It was like, I remember when and a lot of it had to do with the circumstances, but in the case of me with Charlotte, the promotion grew so big that the family organization that was Jim Crockett Promotions didn't have the infrastructure to handle a company that just grew hugely, almost instantly. And so it made sense for them to sell, which, they sold to Turner. And because Turner had the resources, they had the connections for global television, for a lot of things. But and maybe I was old school in that sense, that I always did well there, was treated well, and I would not have been comfortable not doing right when it came time to move on. That's me personally, and not everybody in the business felt that way, but that's certainly how I felt.
So who was the actual one that's kind of assigned to bringing in the talent? Is it Vince himself? Is it Pat Patterson? Would it be like a Jerry Briscoe at this point? I mean, who is actually bringing in talent?
Well, Vince has the final say. Certainly, Briscoe had a role. Pat Patterson definitely had a role. Terry Garvin, to a degree, had the role. And actually, in Charlotte, because of Terry's friendship with Pat, Terry left to go up there where he was going to run towns and was going to give him some job security. And when Terry went up there, I would have conversation with him. And this was at a time when Crockett was you could tell when there's a problem, even if you don't know the details. I remember, like, we would get paid weekly, and there would be a breakdown for each of the towns and an amount. It wouldn't be like a salary. It would be amount allocated to each of the towns. If the town was better, you expected a better payday. If it was a smaller town, it would be less. And if it was a disaster of a town, you still expected a minimum compensation. And that's how the business was structured, and that's how talent were accustomed to being compensated. I'm sure there was a chance to make sure that certain people reached a certain level, whether it was a bonus in the check or something to bring them up to a level if the towns didn't all do that well. But that's how the business was structured. There weren't true salaries, except at a certain level you expected that you were going to make within a certain range on every given week.
Now, as far as the WWF at this point, obviously you got Vince. We talked about Pat and Jerry and Terry Garvin. What is Shane McMahon's role at this point? He's relatively young, but kind of not that young. I'm sure I want to say maybe since early 20s at this point. I'm not even sure.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, probably early 20s would make sense. So what is his role at this point?
He wasn't involved, as I remember, and I can understand this, that I think Shane, it would have been an impossible role for anyone, especially a son, to really grow under Vince's shadow, because Vince was such a high-profile figure that when you think about it, I mean, how could somebody like Shane become successful without people maybe resenting and say, well, he doesn't deserve to be there. He hasn't earned it. He's only getting it because he was Vince's son. But that's the reason I think that he went to China to try to make his own mark apart from his father. And I respected Shane for that. He wanted to accomplish something on his own.
You think at all in WWF that he was kind of being groomed? Because you always saw him kind of being a referee on TV, or maybe being somewhat of not an agent per se, but somebody that working. You hear behind the scenes. You hear that he's doing camera. He's doing this and that. Like, was he being groomed at all? Like, as far as, okay, we're going to let him do every aspect of the business, and hopefully eventually he'll catch up and he'll learn so much, and he'll be one of the guys.
I think that's a very smart approach, and made sense, because to immediately go at the highest level and be working with people, all of whom came up through the ranks and paid their dues, would sometimes, especially if he's a younger guy, and dealing with guys that are years older, that have been in the business, that have reached the higher levels, would have been really tough. And doing it this way, he had been hands-on every aspect of the business. And the other good part of that too is that it also gave him a better understanding of what was involved with every aspect. So if you're dealing with the people that do your television, that work camera and so forth, whatever their problems may be, they can come to you and discuss it with you, and you can understand what they're doing and relate to it because you had done it yourself.
Did you have any sort of relationship with him at all?
With Shane?
Yeah.
Not really. I was there quite a while before he came back, and never really, I don't think I was ever there for any time. I don't even think I was there for a time when he came back and had a top management role.
Now, as far as the time period around 1990 in the WWF, this is obviously before Flair comes in, and last week we talked a little bit about Macho Man and the payroll issues, and we talked a little bit about Andre maybe having a little bit of resentment, or maybe not trusting you because you're from the South, and we were talking a little bit about how Hulk Hogan kind of would just deal directly with Vince. But a guy that we didn't talk about, who was a big star of this era, is the Ultimate Warrior, and eventually WrestleMania 6 in 1990, he becomes world champion. What was kind of your dealings with him? Because he is such a unique guy, and I feel like if your talent relations and you're dealing with the Ultimate Warrior, something tells me he's going to be a little bit different to deal with than some of the other guys.
I think to say that he was high strung would be an understatement. but he also was he was a very unique talent that if somebody had the idea of saying, well, I'm going to create this guy who's got an athletic body, not really a great mechanical wrestler, but he's got the body, and we're going to put armbands with stringers down his biceps and have him run to the ring like a wild man. He has to create that himself, and then you watch it, and you watch the response to the people, and it was obvious that, and we've talked about this at various times over the weeks, the it factor. And if you ask me again, how do you define the it factor? Well, I can't define it. I've struggled over years to try and write down what the it factor is. The only thing I can tell you is a talent either has it or they don't, and it's something that you can't teach somebody or pass on to somebody. They either have it or they don't.
What were your thoughts on Warrior? You thought he definitely had it?
There was something. Yes, he had it. There was something that the fans gravitated to him because he was not a polished performer. He was somebody that would go out there and couldn't give you long matches because he was so high energy. I mean, his music would hit and he would bust through that curtain and he would run to the ring with his streamers, and then he would get in the ring and he would bounce from rope to rope to rope, and then he'd go to a rope and he would shake it like a wild man. I mean, he had his own thing that made him different than everybody else, and his matches didn't go real long, but he electrified the audience, and that's really what you can't ignore. You say, and he's got it. The people are the judge and jury. They're responding to it. Okay, how do we get the most out of this? And that's the challenge of being creative and being in charge of talent management.
What did you think about promos?
he would do promos, and for me, I was always a storyteller. So there was a story that I told with every promo. I would listen to him promo, and when he was done, if you asked me what he had just said, I could tell you I don't know. but and we laugh about it, but he just electrified and mesmerized people, and just was this unique character. And he couldn't be a traditional wrestler in that his interviews were important into talking people into the seats. You had to get there other ways by creating an issue between him and somebody else. But that's what made him unique, and maybe that's what the people saw in him and why they were so supportive of him, because he was different.
He was so charismatic. He definitely was very
charismatic.
Over.
That's the word that I forgot. Yes, that's the word that really best describes him. He was charismatic.
What did you think about him behind the scenes? Was he as crazy behind the scenes as he was in front of the camera?
I would call him unorthodox. He was different, but I always got along with him. Because I think that's why I had longevity in the business and success in the business, because I had been a talent myself. So I understood virtually everything that a talent, regardless of their style or what they were about, because I had been a talent. So I could really relate to almost any situation. And there was no standard thing, well, this is how I deal with talent, and that they have to conform to my guidelines. To be successful, you got to be the other way. You got to have certain things that you have to be supportive of because of your role for that promotion, so that the thing doesn't blow up and go crazy. But you have to understand that you're in a unique business with a bunch of sometimes crazy individuals, and it's up to you to somehow manage to keep all of that in order and get the most out of everybody so that we all benefit from it.
Have you ever worked with a guy like him? Like you said, he's unorthodox, he's different. Was there anybody kind of comparable to him, or was he definitely unique unto himself?
I think he was unique unto himself. I can't remember anybody that was, which I think had a lot to do with why he was so successful, because he was so different.
I think smart move at that point, taking the belt off Hogan, him going over on Hogan at WrestleMania 6. Do you think that was the right decision?
Well, that's hard to answer. I'm a firm believer in not playing hot potato with the belt, going from guy to guy to guy. I remember when I first started full time in the business. Trying to think of who was. I don't know. Like Lou Thez had held the title for 25 years off and on, and then the title changed hands, and it stayed. And I forget even who it was, but he remained champion for 4 years, which, you would think, well, if the fans come to the arena, you build up a match that you plant the seed that a challenger is going to defeat a champion in your town, and you need to buy a ticket and be there to watch it happen. And then when a guy becomes champion and stays champion for 4 years, you got to keep telling that story and keep making the fans believe, well, this is finally the guy, and this could be it. You better be there and buy a ticket and see it. And that was the challenge of keeping business going. And as long as they had good matches and you had logical finishes and entertained the people, you can keep following that formula almost indefinitely.
The thing with Warrior is you always hear stories about him being difficult. And was he difficult at all? Because I know, obviously, at SummerSlam 91, there was a bit of an issue, and Vince even says, he couldn't have waited to fire him as soon as he walked backstage, and he wanted more money going out, and then all of a sudden
Yeah.
Vince agreed, and then so what was the whole situation there? Was that a difficult situation?
It was difficult in the sense that it was not a very professional move or a very smart move on the part of a Warrior. You don't take Vince and hold him up for money on any one given night, because if you think about it, the first time that Vince said okay and adheres to the demand and lets it go, what that scenario is going to happen again and again and again. And then if you don't draw the line the first time, it's going to kill your business. And so it doesn't matter about who the talent is or how important they are or how hot they are at the time, but if they hold you up that night, you don't have any choice. They're there. They're in the arena. All those people are sitting out there. The house is what the house is. And if you allow that person to hold you up and get away with it, then he controls your business. You don't control it, and you can't survive and let that happen.
Were you shocked that night when he did that? Because you hear it behind the scenes, like, guys, hold up Vince before he goes out to the ring. He's part of a main event, match made in heaven, the match made in hell. He's going to team with Hogan that night. Sid's the referee. You got Adnan Slaughter and the Iron Sheik, a.k.a. Mustafa, on the other side. I mean, he's a big role and a big part of the main event of the night. You shocked that he would pull that?
Surprised that he did not have enough experience to see the big picture, and if he had, he would have understood that he was basically cutting his own throat. You hold him up that night. Yep. What's Vince going to say? No, and you don't go out there. You got the house in there. You got to go out there and get through that night. But then you then cut the tie at that point. And no matter how much you got invested in them or how over they are, the minute that you let them dictate to you and you let them get away with it, and there's no price to pay for it, you might as well kiss your business goodbye. And most guys know that. They can say, okay, if I'm going to hold the guy up tonight, and I'm going to get probably a lot more money than I would have otherwise. But most guys think, well, what about next week and the week after and the week after? And don't realize that, okay, hey, oh, wow, I got 3 times what I could have because I held Vince up. And don't think about, this guy's been in the promotion, he's the 3rd generation, and he's still in business because he didn't allow this situation to happen and to get by with it. But a lot of guys just don't. I don't want to go and say they're not smart, but I guess they're not smart when they do something like that. Yeah, they did something that night, but at what cost? Because it probably cost them a lot more, where they would have been better off in their position if they'd kind of adhered to norms like they should have been.
What was it like backstage when the match is over and he comes back through and Vince fires him? Was it like pandemonium? Was it just Vince was pissed off and that was the end of it? Like, what happened backstage that night?
I think he was shocked, and then it's okay. Nothing in the wrestling business shocked me, and if that happened, I knew that Vince had no choice, had to do what he had to do. Then it was immediately, okay, we got to think about tomorrow and the day after and next week and try to figure out the best way to regroup and, keep business going.
Yeah, him and Hogan at this point were the kind of the 2 babyface stars, and eventually, obviously the things change and War ends up coming back at WrestleMania 8, and which is a few months later, and Vince, I guess, forgives him and whatever. Is that one of those things where anything is forgivable in the wrestling business? Warrior can come back even after he pulled that shenanigans. Vince will still bring him back. As long as you're a good business, it's okay, and eventually things will work themselves out.
Well, the fact that Vince cut ties that night. Here's a guy that made a demand and held him up for money before he went out there, and then was finished as of that night. So he goes home and it's like, okay, I'm looking on this given night what more I got than I would have otherwise, but I lost everything going forward. So Was it such a smart move? And you got to let guys go through that and experience it. And then maybe 5 years goes by and he comes back, and the guy comes back with his tail between his legs, and it's like, I learned my lesson. I realized that it was more than just holding you up for what compensation I got for that night, and what did I forfeit as a result of making that decision that day. And it was very stupid of me to do that. And most guys then figure it out.
And it's only basically 6 months or so later, Vince ends up bringing back Warrior for WrestleMania 8. And it's just kind of surprising, just that return, because you didn't see it coming. Kind of a weird placement. Hulk and Sid in the main event that night. Papa Shango comes out. They're double teaming Hulk after the DQ. And then Warrior makes a surprise appearance. Huge pop, of course. That long entranceway that he ran down, he was probably exhausted by the time he got in the ring.
Yeah.
It definitely looked like it. Was that just kind of like one of those things like, okay, Warrior's good business, we need him back, and obviously Hulk is on his way out as he's trying to go a little bit into Hollywood, he's going to be doing some movies, and he's going to step away for a bit. Is that one of those things where Vince is like, okay, I'll forgive you, you're good business, we need you back, and you're going to be one of the top baby faces?
The business is full of stories about where guys got second chances. And if he was any kind of a smart businessman, he would understood that what he did that night, he paid a price for, because the umbilical cord was cut that night, and all that he could have made going forward. Here's a guy who's not booked as of that next day. And okay, he has a name for himself or whatever, and he, a guy like that is a talent that is always going to find a place to go, because there's always a territory that's down that is looking for something like that. But most guys figure it out that to do that, especially to somebody like Vince McMahon, it just isn't a good business decision.
As far as WrestleMania 8, you had a big role in that creatively. Was that kind of one of your, basically one of the things where you get more responsibility for that show? Was WrestleMania 8
that was
one of those shows where you had more responsibility?
That was in Indianapolis. Yeah, what happened there was Terry Garvin and the ring crew reported to Pat Patterson. And there was an incident that hit the papers in New York, and it was a big scandal that involved Terry, and Vince had no choice other than he had to have Pat fire Terry Garvin, and then Vince had to somehow show that Pat was ultimately responsible because he let it happen, and that what's his name reported to Pat. So that's why Pat was suspended. And during that period of time, Pat did not come around. I don't know what kind of communication there was between Pat and Vince. I would not have been surprised if Vince continued to. It didn't have a contract, but I would not have been surprised if Pat didn't receive some compensation with Vince through that period of time. And it was like a 6-month period where, and Indianapolis was the next big pay-per-view, and where Pat and I would do it together. It was like, okay, this is all your baby. You figure it out, book the card, and you're going to have to run everything. And which I fortunately was able to do, and it did very well. But I also realized that how important Pat was. That Pat to me was the smartest guy that I ever worked around in the business, in terms of, because he'd been a main eventer as a talent, a huge run with him and Stevens in San Francisco, and then again up in Minneapolis for Vern. And he was great with all of the talent. And I saw firsthand, like every time they had a major event like WrestleMania, nothing was left to chance. The two people would do a build-up to to WrestleMania, and Pat would they would find a location somewhere where there was a ring set up, where there was no audience or nobody that would see him, and he would take the two guys and have them work out in the ring together, have a mini match in front of Pat that would give them a comfort level with each other. And then the last thing was, I think they would actually have an unadvertised dark match in a town in front of a live audience, in a very small town, just to give them a comfort level of doing whatever they were doing in front of the people. And it was a very smart way to run your business, rather than having something as big as WrestleMania, to have two guys that were veteran performers, but take it that extra step by having them actually in the ring together in front of a live audience somewhere else where nobody really knew that they had faced each other before, and they thought that encounter at WrestleMania was the first time they were ever going to see each other. But the end result was you had one hell of a match.
Now, as far as that controversy with Terry Garvin and the ring crew, and basically a horrible sex scandal that hit the WWF at that point, were you shocked? I know you mentioned a few times, Gina, nothing really surprised you. Shocked?
Yeah.
Is that one of those things? It's kind of one of those things that shocks us. Man, that's not something I thought of with Terry Garvin.
Terry was a friend, had been a friend for a long time, and in this business, there are all kinds of people. They're gays, they're straights, they're I mean, like I say, nothing surprised me, and I look at someone what they contribute to the success of the promotion. And Terry, there was nobody better than getting towns and going out and knowing how to promote them and have the towns be successful. Terry Garvin was, in my opinion, the best guy that I ever worked with for doing that. And he was close with Pat, and it just was one of those really, really sad things. And what was bad was because it involved underage guys that were handling the ring crew, and it hit the papers in New York, and you couldn't ignore it or sweep it under, because the especially the guy in New York that really hated Vince would have made you suffer terribly if you didn't if you didn't do something about it. And it was sad. It was unfortunate, but
it is, just when you think about it, like shocking, disgusting, crazy, and not good. Was Pat ever kind of, not that he's guilty of it or anything, but was he ever thought of, as far as everybody backstage, was he kind of thought of poorly at this point, or was eventually when he comes back he's forgiven completely?
Yeah, well, Pat was very, very highly respected in the business. First, because he could set up matches for WrestleMania or anywhere, and two guys would not ever second guess whatever Pat's input or critiquing or creative input, because Pat had been there and had such an incredible record on top for a long time in San Francisco. And then it wasn't it's just that one territory where he excelled. No, he went to Minneapolis and the same thing happened. So whatever Pat said, and he would always main events for WrestleMania, basically be in charge of taking the two guys and then getting together, having worked out privately and critique the match, so that when it happened at the actual live event, there was never a disappointment, because Pat was hands-on with everything, and he really was as good an in-ring performer as I ever saw. Period.
Did you ever have a conversation with him about this whole scandal and this whole controversy after it happened?
No. It's like, what would there have been to discuss? And I mean, I already knew everything that was going on, and what was I going to say to Pat? Why did you let this happen? I mean, there was nothing to discuss. It just was a sad situation. And when Pat had to let Terry go, and because Terry had reported to Pat, Vince had to suspend Pat. And like I said, to this day, it would not surprise me if he continued to get a paycheck for those 6 months. I don't know. They would never ask. None of my business. And I remember all of a sudden, starting with that Indianapolis pay-per-view, it was, instead of Pat and I with Vince, it was myself and Vince, which was okay, which was good that business didn't suffer because of that, which probably increased my stock value in that without Pat there, business didn't go in the tubes, and that I was able to work with Vince and really keep up the momentum and do well. And I remember 6 months went by, and we used to be in the office during the week taking care of all, because Vince was hands-on with every aspect of the business. Posters for shows and things, he had to give his blessing to the artwork and everything. He was hands-on with everything. And I remember still that 6 month period of time, still going out to the house with just Vince and I now, doing all of the booking and matchmaking for TV, and was out there one Sunday, and we used to work in the summertime out on. He had a veranda that was covered over right next to the pool, and he had a whole bank of phones out there. And we're out there one day, and we're sitting there, and Vince looks at me and he says, "I have a surprise for you." "Oh, really?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "Turn around." And as I turned around to look at the back of the house, here around the corner comes Pat Patterson. And I just smiled, and I was really happy to see him. I like Pat as a person, had tremendous respect for his ability as an in-ring talent, but for what he did with matchmaking and all aspects of the business, and the guys all related to him, because if he was going to set up a match and gave a constructive criticism, nobody ever questioned his validity in making that, because Pat had performed at the highest level for a sustained period of time and in more than just one place. So Pat could speak from having done, not always, a lot of guys could be good talking in theory and be good at it, but Pat had that added dimension of having been successful himself. So when he said something or laid something out, he had that added credibility.
Then, and before he returns, WrestleMania 8, that it wasn't Hogan versus Flair, the two biggest stars of that era were in wrestling. And you always hear stories like, oh, well, they tried it in 91 and the house shows didn't draw well, and MSG didn't draw as well as they thought, and this or that. What was the reason for the change? Because it seemed like Hogan and Flair were on a collision course, and then you change it, and it becomes Flair versus Savage and Hogan versus Sid.
Yeah, well, the thing with Flair, there was such a high expectation of what was going to happen when the two of them finally met, and that's part of the great mystique of the wrestling business. That in theory, something looks to be a grand slam home run, and when it's out there and happening, it doesn't give you the results that you anticipated, and you can't explain why. To this day, I can't explain why. And you then have to recognize that and make adjustments, because you can't take the attitude that the audience is the judge and jury. If something goes out there and you start with this great anticipation that it's going to be so huge, and there's something missing, and it doesn't get the box office result that you expect, and it's not just one town, it's more than that. It's a bigger thing. And try to figure out why. If we all knew that and had the magic formula, I'd be sitting in maybe Vince's house now, one just like it up the street. but that's the thing with about the business. You can anticipate what the fans are going to think or do or react, but there's no guarantee. And there's times when you get out there and you're anticipating the response of the crowd and you expect them to blow the roof off the building, and it's half, 2/3 of the reaction that you thought it was going to be. And there are also times where you put something together, I would say, like, to basically in between something that you think is a big program. Well, I'll put these two together temporary just to keep everybody good without any thought that it's going to be huge box office. And they get out there and it is huge box office. And it's like, I don't understand this. And when you think that you got the business figured out, it is time to hang it up and quit, because you'll never figure it out. The people, again, are the ultimate judge and jury. And you don't know till you put it out there and let the jury speak.
And I think that's kind of the perfect kind of ending point, or the stopping point, because, I mean, literally we could do a whole episode on WrestleMania 8 and we can kind of, dissect the card and even go into further into the, supposed to be Hogan, Flair, and then the change to Hogan, Sid, and then obviously Macho Man and Flair having their epic feud, and even Bret Hart and Piper having an awesome match, and that blade job controversy, and all that kind of stuff. But I think this is like the perfect stopping point, because I think that and some other controversies around that era could be whole separate episodes by themselves, for sure.
John, I think you're absolutely right. I think you're absolutely right.
And as far as you, what do you got coming up as far as some personal appearances? I know you got a lot of them coming up towards the end of the year here.
Yeah, I got to find my date book. It's terrible. If I don't have it written down, hold on a minute. Bear with me.
JJ's keeping himself so busy these days, which is great, because you got to have one of the all-time greatest managers, the leader of the Four Horsemen, out there meet and greeting the fans and doing all these kind of different things, and really, really getting out there, meeting the people, and still being being as popular as you were. You know what I mean? All these years later.
Sometimes
people still want to see you.
I pinch myself that I go out and appear at a show and it does extremely well, and the fans come by and are very, very, very gracious and very kind, but I never let it go to my head. I try to always keep both feet on the ground, and knowing that the fans, and it's like and that's one thing I'll say about Flair, and I subscribe to the same thing. That Flair as a champion would go out in front of a building with 20,000 people and go out there and give you a 50-minute match that would just tear the roof down. And then you would and it didn't happen very often, but because you would have to fill the calendars, so especially the underneath guys, so that they had a payday every night that collectively that made their week. So guys sometimes would have to go to towns that just didn't have a huge population, or the TV was at a weird time. And you go to a town like that, and instead of a $25,000 house, you got a $5,000 house. And some guys would say, okay, well, I'm just going to go through the motions. I'm not going to take a chance on getting hurt or whatever. And that's the reason that Flair goes down as one of the great champions, if not the greatest champion of all time, because he would go out there and give you the same effort for those 500 people that were there than he did the night before in another arena where there were 5,000 people. And it was just professional pride that he didn't believe in shortcuts. And night after night to do that takes a toll on your body, but that's how Ric Flair operated, and that's why he is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, champions of all time, because that was his work ethic.
Absolutely, well said. And as far as personal appearance, I do know on November 23rd, you will be in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania at the old ECW Arena.
Yes.
I know that for sure. That's one booking I definitely know for sure.
Charlie Armstrong Hartman has me there, and he's been booking me around different places. But Philly's a big one coming up, and I live in Delaware, not far from Philly, and so I'm excited to go to Philly because I know it's going to do well.
And of course, check out the JJ Dillon store on Pro Wrestling Tees. Yes, ProWrestlingTees.com/JJ Dillon. Get yourself a JJ shirt. Check us out on Patreon. A new Patreon page has been set up for a JJ where you can become a patron and support the show. Please check out TMPTEmpire.com. On there, you'll see a link to the JJ podcast. And on there, a link to the JJ website, jjdillon.com, where I highly encourage you to buy JJ's book, Wrestlers Are Like Seagulls, from McMahon to McMahon. And, of course, please continue to email us at jjdillonpodcast@gmail.com. That is jjdillonpodcast@gmail.com. And in the upcoming weeks, we will have a JJ episode, which is Ask JJ Anything. Got a couple really good questions in so far, actually a bunch. Got to kind of sift through and find the really good ones, but that will definitely be a future episode where we'll do an Ask JJ Anything. That is for sure. So please continue on sending us questions. Even do it via Twitter at 2Man Power Trip, #AJJA. So that's pretty much all the plugs, JJ. You got a lot going on, a lot to kind of divulge, but kind of looking forward to doing a Q&A in a few weeks with you.
Yes, and John, you know that I don't do the show for anything other than the fans, and it's like everything that I have in the way of material things and whatever accolades in terms of Hall of Fame rings and plaques. It's only because of the fans that I always was never the biggest or the best, but nobody worked harder than I did or loved the business more than I did. And I think the fans can sense that when it's not a job, it's a passion.